The U.S. okayed an additional $225 million in military aid to Ukraine. United States officials unveiled the new package Thursday, comprised of munition for Kiev's forces to defend the city of Kharkiv from a heavy Russian assault. In a sit-down meeting with the war-torn nation's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, last week, Biden doubled down on support. Let's listen.
I'm not going to walk away from you. I apologize for those weeks of not knowing what's going to happen in terms of funding.
As the Ukraine-Russian war goes on and on, so does the United States' willingness to help. But will our endless support actually cause Ukraine to win this war and defeat Russia? Here to help us get to the bottom is Jason Beardsley, a 22-year military veteran with 15 years in Army Special Ops and Joint Special Ops. So great to have you on the program, Jason. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me here.
So yet more funding to help Ukraine defend itself, even though it seems to me that so many military analysts, intelligence officials, both Ukrainian and American, have come to profoundly question whether the war can be won from the standpoint of ejecting Russia from the country. Actually, I don't even think that's really on the table anymore. What is this new amount of money going to accomplish?
Well, you have a couple things here, and I think you're right to point out that a lot of analysts have seen that the Russian advance here is really at its stall point. There's not a likelihood that they will take more territory, but there's also not a likelihood that Ukraine can regain that territory without some massive injection. So this $225 million is relatively small, but what is more significant is the decision that was made by the administration to authorize the use of American weapon systems to do retaliatory strikes into Russian territory. And what that really means, I think most people would understand this, is those systems that are launching attacks against the city of Kharkiv are now vulnerable, or those areas, those weapon systems Russia is using, to retaliation strikes from Ukraine. But that begs the question, what is the plan? What is the clear strategy? Because that's been off the table since the beginning of this conflict. The fact that it's back on now is exactly what folks have been warning about with regards to escalation. We are there now.
And so the United States giving additional funding is, of course, getting some backlash from the anti-interventionist, isolationist part of both the right and the left in the United States. Now, this amount of money will help immediately, but it seems that there's always an immediate need of money. Of course there is, right? The country was invaded by Russia. Will there be a time where the U.S. is involved in a peace negotiation, or NATO is involved in a peace negotiation, where lines are drawn in the sand and they might not be what the U.S. wants, but will be better in the long run and save the United States dollars in the long run?
This will largely depend on who's actually pushing in the White House for these negotiations. What we've seen up till now is not an exhaustive press for negotiated settlement. Veterans like myself, combat veterans from different wars, have recognized that when the strategy is unclear or it's ambiguous, you're leaving your troops vulnerable. And what we have now on the ground are trainers and advisors that are now in proximity combat. We have U.S. weapon systems. Listen, we have actually supported Ukraine to the tune of billions of dollars, even more so than our United States Marine Corps is funded on an annual basis. So we've put a lot of commitments together. But the question you've asked is, when will this line in the sand be drawn? And the answer is going to come down to, frankly, wearing out the forces on either side of this line. That's Ukrainian forces that are being ground down. It's Russian forces that are holding ground, and taking that territory back requires an enormous amount of material. It's not going to happen anytime soon. So we would like to see, those of us who are concerned about escalation, some sort of reasonable settlement started to be proposed by the White House. They should be using all their power to do that. We haven't seen it yet, so we're not looking at a near end to this anytime soon.
Yeah, on the contrary, the Biden administration has said from day one that we will defend Ukraine utterly and totally until the defeat of Russia, even though that remains impossible from an intelligence perspective, from a military advisor perspective. From people have told Zelensky that from the Ukrainian analysis side, and then I think the fear becomes, does continuing to fund Ukraine, to give military advice, to be closely tied to the fate of the Zelensky administration, does that risk the U.S. being in a broader confrontation with Russia that would be harmful to the U.S. security, and does it make Ukraine ultimately worse off if it causes them to lose militarily more utterly, as you described a process of the troops being ground down, as Russia slowly, inevitably conquers more and more territory? Will then Ukraine have less to bargain with when it does eventually come to diplomacy, as we know it must at some point?
These are really sharp questions. And that's the point I think a lot of people are concerned about, both on the right and the left. There's a consensus of why are we funding more of this when we should be looking for a settlement? It may not be perfect. It's not going to be maximal for what the United States wants or what Ukraine wants. But in the reality is, meanwhile, we're losing generations of Ukrainians. We're spending a lot of money the United States does not have. And we've come out of two conflicts of our own. I represent Concerned Veterans for America, where we deployed to places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and then watched in the end of those when we wasted a lot of money and then turned the states back over to our enemies. So we don't have the biggest track record. And we're now looking at depleting American resources to fund this war that's a proxy war with a nuclear power. All of these things should be warning bells or alarms going off in D.C., but instead you see the opposite. You actually see politicians saying, as you said, let's fund this inevitably to the end, but there is no clear objective. And for the military to be on the ground, for advisors to be on the ground, for our weapon systems to be in place, we ought to know precisely what the administration sees as the win or the victory here. And without that, we are risking more escalation, depletion of resources, while at the same time jeopardizing our authorities.
And so we're in a position right now where if the United States decides we're going to continue to fund Ukraine, we're going to continue to stay in this war, regardless of what's happened up until this point, do you think we are absolutely at the point where we make this calculation? Will the cost be greater in terms of dollars, weapons, and human lives if the U.S. continues to support Ukraine versus pushing, an ending of the war? Are we at that point now?
Absolutely.
Where you think
absolutely
the cost
again
is greater?
Another question, but the other point here is that this is an asymmetric war, and what we mean when we say asymmetric is first understanding the symmetry. The symmetry war is tanks and infantry and planes and rocket systems going against each other. That's what we see on the ground in Ukraine. The asymmetrical part is the warfare of economics. It's when Russia uses lawfare in the United States to stop a liquid natural gas pipeline from exporting LNG to Europe. So it's the warfare that you see in the Red Sea when the Houthis are firing at our ships and disrupting commerce. There's other means of warfare these states take against each other. And in the United States, we're not only risking the direct cost on the ground with lives at risk. Again, our U.S. trainers and advisors are in proximal relation to the combat now. So you have lives at risk, you have resources depleted, and then you have what's on the asymmetrical side, which is, again, the shadow war that happens between nation states that's economical, it's cyber, it's the attacks on our U.S. infrastructure. Those are all under attack right now. It's not something the United States, the administration is going to talk about openly, but it is happening.
The world is feeling more and more dangerous with increased conflict in the Middle East, the Ukraine conflict continuing, mounting tensions with China from the U.S. perspective. These are serious, weighty foreign policy issues that will be part of the debate between Biden and Trump, et cetera. You have a number of Republicans, some Democrats, but mostly it's a minority of Republicans, I think, talking about the need to end funding for the Ukrainian military operation in order to have there be diplomacy. It seems to me this is a salient issue for American taxpayers, wondering if this is the best use of their money. Is there an argument that this is also leaving the U.S. military somewhat depleted and would be unable to respond to threats we would face in other contexts? A tremendous amount of weapons being sent, ammunition, and those kinds of things being sent to Ukraine. And I'm even wondering at some point who is left in Ukraine to use these weapons in battle? Because we hear about the draft being expanded, people, less and less combat-ready people being called to serve in Ukraine. Also, people who are exhausted, who have been at the front lines for a long time, who haven't had a decent night's sleep with all the explosions and noise going on. Are they even going to be equipped? If we equip them, are they capable of even using some of these supplies? Are they going to be left behind and then picked up by our enemies, as we found in Afghanistan and so many other places?
You're really framing some poignant points here that I think often get missed. And we'll start with the conscription on the ground in Ukraine. And the people that are in Ukraine know this to be sort of a two-state at present, right? You have the West, where they're partying and they're going to nightclubs. You have the East, where our people are conscripted and they're in brutal combat for years now. And now you have these massive conscription movements to go pull people off the street and impress them into service. They're getting as little as 3 days training. I have friends who have been on the ground there, special operations guys in the contractor role, who have witnessed the type of training they're going through, and then they're sending them to the front line. So there is a brutality to this war that is being missed. So that's on one point, the morale, if you will, the spirit of the people. Now, there are people in Ukraine who are desperate to have this fight, but there are other people who are living their lives as if it's in a normal state of condition. They're not touching the war. So that's one. On the second point, or the first point really you brought up about the munitions in the United States, we have very real conversations happening in our Department of Defense currently for recruiting numbers that we're failing to meet, whether it's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. Most of them are failing to meet their recruit numbers. We're losing the people that want to serve. That affects combat veterans like myself that we represent at Concerned Veterans for America that are saying we've been exhausted by manpower first. Secondly, our munitions, the actual manufacturing of weapon systems, whether it's the 155 millimeter mortar shells, the HIMARS rockets, the Javelin rockets, all these different technical weapon systems take a lot of manufacturing to produce. And what we've learned in Ukraine, this should not have been a surprise, but it seemed like it was. Our generals have learned that when you're in a shooting war with Russia, you use a lot of munitions. So we have exhausted some of those resources. We've tried to ramp up production lines, but production in the United States takes a while. And there's a lot of things to go through. And then we have to look at how do we fund our own military systems when, number one, our naval systems are lagging behind their Chinese peer rivals to defend the Indo-Pacific and Taiwan. Our weapon systems that are defending our troops in places like the Middle East are also being exhausted. Patriot missile air defense systems. We've seen those pull from our battlefields in the Middle East to support Ukraine. So you see this happening in a lot of different ways, and it's not covered much. But the end question, or the end of your question, is this wise? And we would suggest no. And again, I think this is a consensus that builds from both right and left, that we ought to be slowing down, pausing, using every tool at our disposal to push these people to come to terms on both sides. That's a hard thing to do. I'm not pretending it's easy, but we hold the lever because the United States is funding this war.
Wise words. Jason Beardsley, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Great discussion.